So, school action plus going, what's it being replaced with? As I've already said, this was also about getting a change in culture at the level of school. So a good school would do really well for children with SEN, whether you had school action placed or not. To look at the needs of the individual child, look at what they needed to put in place to help them progress if they were falling behind. If that wasn't working, they would put more support in place. And that typically got described as if you started doing that, you put a child on school action. If you were doing continuing support and that wasn't working and they still had additional needs and needed more support, you would move them to school action plus. If that still wasn't working, after a time you would start to discuss with the local authority whether they needed a statement or not. The categories school action and school action plus have gone, but that underlying process of assessing and intervening, seeing whether it's working, moving on, has not. And that's what the graduated response is called. And that's what the government says the new system is. There's going to be one single category, as they're calling it, of SEN, before you get to the education, health and care plan. And what the government is saying is that schools have now got to assess, plan, do and review. So essentially, if the teacher is concerned about a child having SEN, if it's not already identified, already coming to school with that designation or disability, what they must do is work with the SENCO to establish if there's an SEND need linked to progress and attainment, as I was talking about. So one of the main triggers would be, has this child fallen behind age-appropriate expectations? And there's a whole definition of that in the code and what it looks like, so that's very clear. And then if so, what are we going to do to address that? And the duty is they've got to put a plan in place to address that. What's fundamental and what's changed in this, they absolutely must, by law, and you will see if you read some of the Code of Practice, there's musts, and musts are in black, boldened. And anywhere when you read that code and it says must, that's a legal requirement. The school or statutory body must do that or they're breaking the law, crudely put. And so they must then inform the parents and the young person. So when I was doing my inquiry, the amount of times parents used to tell me, I only found out my child had SEN when I went to the parents' evening. And they said, well, of course your child's not doing very well in this, that and the other, because they're school action or they're school action plus. And the parents wouldn't have been told, wouldn't have been consulted, wouldn't have been involved in what happens around all of that. And so what the new system says is that right from the beginning, parents and the young person or child must be told if they're being told that they have an SEN need, and you then must be involved in the plan about what's going to happen to address that need. I'm talking at the moment about a non-statutory plan. This is before education, health and care plan stage. Put that plan in place, see if it works, whether it starts to address those learning needs. If it does not, you then have to either change the plan, put something else in place, put some additional extra support in place. If it's still not, then meaning that the child can make the progress that you're expecting from that plan, you keep going, you get more specialist support in. And essentially you keep going with that process until the school has exhausted its specialist expertise and its ability to deal with that child or young person to the best of its abilities, its best endeavours. I mean, this is what best endeavours looks like. They've tried all of that out with their delegated resources, it's not working. At that point, they would then talk to the local authority about whether an education, health and care plan should be issued for that young person, if they haven't already got one. And we well know some children with disabilities or profounder levels of SEN need will come into the school with that all already identified from the early years checks and the early years process. But when not, then this is the process that has to be followed. And that's essentially the graduated response. The fact that school action and school action plus has gone should make no difference to the responsibilities for schools. Remember, the SEN definition has stayed the same, so they can't suddenly say these children haven't got SEN anymore. They've still got SEN. It's simply that you don't separate them all now into two categories, one school action, the other school action plus. Now, I know there'll be a feeling about, well, actually, hang on a minute, wasn't school action plus the way we got extra resources for our children in the system? That went a while ago in terms of how you got extra resources. When schools got more money delegated directly to them, simply being able to use the school action plus as a kind of trigger for extra resources has gone. So that should make no difference. Hearts delegates a lot of its money to schools already. They will have delegated SEN budgets. I know you can talk with heads about whether it's enough and how it's deployed, and there's a big debate around all of that, but essentially, legally, that's what's supposed to happen for the system. And that's what happens now instead of School Action Plus. Whether schools are going to be absolutely required to remove that designation on the 1st of September, there's still a little bit of debate about, because we were expecting by now all the rules and regulations around the school bits to come out, and they still haven't. So it definitely will be going, but whether that still now goes on the 1st of September or gets delayed a bit, or schools can choose whether they implement it in the first term or the second term, we're still waiting, because we haven't seen the kind of schedule of timings to see when the government has said they've got to do this. But don't take the wrong message away. School Action Plus is definitely going. This whole thing I was talking about what schools' duties are, someone was saying earlier, well, what do they have to do? What they have to do is use their best endeavours to make sure that a child with SEN gets the support they need. And as I was saying, this is not, well, I'll do the minimum required. Best endeavours is a high legal duty. It's about everything that a reasonable professional would do with all the resources at their disposal to meet the needs of that individual child to achieve the best possible outcomes. And that's the standard that the government are saying should be in place for all schools. Best endeavours isn't new. There's always been a legal duty for schools to use their best endeavours for children with SEN. But in doing that, they've got to ensure at the level of the school that children and young people with SEN engage in the activities of the school alongside people who do not have SEN. So there's no one set of activities that are just for children with SEN. At all times, they must be trying to ensure that children with SEN can participate as fully as possible in all the activities of the school. Don't misunderstand that, though. If your child needs some additional extra specific kind of support or different activities, that's the only way they can engage in all of that, then obviously it's right they should have that. It's not simply saying everybody's the same, but it is saying as far as possible you should think of and be able to include children with SEN in the normal activities of the school. They also have to prepare a report on the implementation of their SEN policy, and also, this next bit isn't new, this comes from the Equality Act again, but they must have clear arrangements for the admission of disabled children and the steps taken to prevent disabled children from being treated less favourably than other children, and also have an accessibility plan for disabled children to make sure that the school is accessible as possible and improve that access over time. So those are some of the clear duties that the school has in relation not just to this legislation, but from 2010 and before, that's been in place for schools in terms of some of those disability duties. That's been in place for much, much longer. Okay, so you've gone through that graduated response and what the school's supposed to do as part of that, and the young person, the child, still isn't thriving, still isn't achieving their outcomes in the way that you would expect, and you decide to issue an education, health and care plan. Why have one? Why this change? Essentially, as I was saying earlier, in a shared houses, nobody does the washing up. If you've got education, health and social care that are all responsible for something, they'll all do their own little bit, but they won't join up and talk to each other, typically. I'm sure in some areas they do, and some services do very well. But overall, within the system, we know that one of the things that's really plagued the system is the inability of professionals to all come together around the child and the family and provide a coherent service for the family, with the family at the centre. That whole concept is called personalisation, if you want the professional jargon. And if you hear people bouncing around talking about personalisation, essentially that's what it means, is how do we make things fit around the parent and the young person rather than you fit around the service providers and the people that are supposed to be sort of providing you. As part of that is to make sure that those agencies then all join up together and you get a coherent set of services around you, that you don't have to have huge numbers of different assessments, you don't have to keep telling your story time after time after time again to each new professional that comes to see you, and that the whole thing should be based on a tell it once principle of once you've told one professional something, they cooperate in a way that they all share this information and you're not forever telling everybody your story over and over. I don't know if any of you have been through the early years programme and early support, but that is very much the principles on which the early support programme were based, and where parents have been through that programme, they notice a fundamental difference both in the culture and the way they're supported by bringing the professionals around the child or the young person and the family, rather than working in those silos. So an education, health and care plan is supposed to start joining the whole system up. So it's a whole plan now from birth through to 25. So those of you that are familiar with the post-16 system, where at the moment you would get a learning disability assessment as you moved into the new system, learning disability assessments are also going. And there's 2 years during which there'll be a transfer for young people that currently are on learning disability assessments to where those will all be gone, because they will have worked their way through the system. There's an issue about those just on the point of transfer, and we can talk more about that. And essentially this is also to make sure there is one system all the way through. So before there were different legal entitlements between pre-16 and post-16, that is essentially more or less gone. There's one system all the way through, from birth right through to 25. And it's of course education, health and care. So it's not just about education, it's the whole system. And there's new duties with that. How do you get everybody to do the washing up? How do you get them all to cooperate and stop working in these silos? Well, there's new duties on all 3 agencies to work together, or there's a strengthening of existing duties for them to work together. As I mentioned, there's a new complaints mechanism for health, so you can complain at the health system if you don't get the health support that's specified in an education, health and care plan. What this means is those 3 agencies now, the process is still quite similar in the sense that if it's identified that your child needs an education, health and care plan, the professionals have to sit down, but this is where it changes. I mean, there always was a requirement to consult parents under statements, and good authorities already did that. But there's a very clear legal requirement now, right at the beginning, to sit down with the parent, child or young person and agree that there is a need for a statement. What that statement then looks like has to be much more person-centred, with the views and aspirations and wishes of the young person as the first part of that, the views and wishes of the parents as the second part, and only then, next part, what outcomes are we trying to achieve as a result of this? Then what provision are we going to put in place to achieve those outcomes? And then that's supposed to come back to the parent and young person and be discussed, further conversation had and agreed, and then a final plan is produced and then agreed again with the parent and young person. So again, parents, young people and children are involved all the way through the process with absolute clarity that they've got to be as part of that process. Legal requirement, they've got to be involved at every stage. The timescale is going down from 26 weeks to 20 weeks, so it's got to be done quicker, which actually can also create some demands on all of you as well as the local authority and the service providers. The fundamental other change is when they sit down to agree that final plan, they have to agree who's going to provide what between themselves as well as with you. So discuss what provision you need to achieve those outcomes, and then that has to be agreed between the 3 service providers so that when you get that plan, you are confident that what's in there can actually be delivered. And that's a fundamental change and a new legal requirement on the service providers as part of the legislation. It's also clarified the legal rights to social care. It's still not totally clear, but it's a very clear requirement that social care have to cooperate in all of this, and that the legal rights to social care, where they're assessed and agreed, have to be provided as well as part of that package, where social care is assessed and agreed. It is still an education, health and care plan, and what I mean by this is government is saying if your child just has some health needs, those should be met. If your child has some social care needs, those should be met. What triggers having to do a joint education, health and care plan is that your child or young person has SEN or disability. And so again, this should not be a worry to anyone in this room, because if your child has SEN disability already, they will have in the new system. The government is also saying that they do not envisage any change in the criteria. So if you had a statement before, you would get an education, health and care plan in the future. So anybody who's sitting here with a statement, unless the needs of your child had changed in such a way that you really didn't need that extra provision anymore, you would, as part of the transfer process, get an education, health and care plan. I think most authorities are planning that for anyone that currently has one, you would help them in the future. Okay? Just to be really clear about that. As I said, in terms of the transfer process, local authorities will have up to, it's actually 3 years and 2 terms from the end of this term to make those transfers and put them in place. And those transfers will be made on a rolling basis with those children coming up to a particular phase of education and moving on to another one will be prioritised in each individual year. So as I was saying, from nursery to infant to primary, primary to secondary, transition phase, post-18, those will be the ones that will be prioritised first for conversion into statements. If you're part-way through, it's much more complicated. If the EHC plan process has been followed rather than the statementing process because you're in a Pathfinder area, and if you agree, and the local authority can demonstrate that they've gone through this rather fuller process, you can both agree to have that counted as an education, health and care plan. Otherwise, it absolutely has to be converted into one. Personal budgets. As part of an education, health and care plan, you can have an entitlement to a personal budget. Okay? This is typically about the additional money you get within an education, health and care plan that isn't already part of the school's budget. So it's the money above and beyond the delegated funds that have gone into the school. It does not mean, typically, that you could go back into your school and say, my child gets X amount of LSA time, I want to pull that money out and have that as a personal budget for my individual child now. It's about the additional and extra resources that are specified as part of an education, health and care plan. Within that, the authority then has to be able to specify the provision you're going to get in a way that, if you wanted, could be chunked up into a personal budget. And the personal budget can work in three different ways. The local authority could say, well, within your education, health and care plan, we're going to provide you with some of this, and some of this. And especially 2 and 3, these are areas where, let's take the classic example around this. So say there's some speech therapy provision in that additional part of the education, health and care plan. And if that was X number of hours, that could be chunked up into an amount of money. Now, you could either say, well, local authority says we're happy to provide that from within, or the health authority is saying we're happy to provide that within services we already provide. This is how much you would get, this is when you would get it. You say, that's fine, carry on, I'm perfectly content with what you're doing. It could be that somebody else provides that speech therapy, like a school or somebody else, a voluntary organisation, or you get some other support in some other way. And that comes at the moment through a voluntary organisation or third party, where either the local authority commissions it or they give you the money to commission it to them. And the third way is funds are paid directly to you as a personal payment, but it's got to be for the things that are agreed within the plan, and there's a lot of rules and regulations about how the local authority ensures that that money is spent on, what it's being intended to be spent on, in terms of the outcomes that you're trying to get for that particular child. And that's a discussion that you can have with your local authority about whether you want to take that as a personal budget. You absolutely do not have to have any of it as a personal budget if you don't want. It's more that you would something you would have to opt into if you wanted to go down that route, and the local authority would have to have a discussion with you about that, and they would have to be confident that those outcomes were going to be achieved, and that the family or the young person, when it's over 16, if they said they wanted the personal budget, had the capacity to actually exercise and manage that for themselves. Additionally, if, say, that speech therapist, you want to come into your local school, the head teacher has to agree that that person come into their school. That's actually reasonable because the head teacher is legally responsible for anything that happens in their school. Well, ultimately the governors are, but that's exercised through the head teacher, and therefore they have to be accountable for anyone that's coming into their school. It's also important in terms of how that person would fit in with the approach within the school and how the school did things. And secondly, although there's no way it's required, if the head teacher wanted to use some of their delegated resources within your education, health and care plan, because it's still, what's in your education, health and care plan would include assumptions about what the school is already providing from their delegated funds, they could do so. But you can't require them to. They would have to agree to put some of it into arrangement. But it might be a better way of doing things. It would depend. If the head teacher's already paying for some speech therapy out of their delegated money, it might be very hard for them to unpack how they fund that if you wanted just 2 hours out of their speech therapist. There wouldn't be a way they could just take those 2 hours out and still be able to pay the speech therapist to come in and do everything else. So it can get quite complicated, but the legal position is you have a right to a personal budget if you've got an education, health and care plan, and if those services would lend themselves to being used in a personal budget. Some of them won't be because they'll be so embedded in a more general service in some way. But you do expect that the more you get into an education, health and care plan, that you're getting a much more personalised package of support, and that's why some of it might be able to be chunked out this way. What that looks like, and I know parents get quite confused about school funding, all this stuff about delegated budgets and what does that mean and what do schools get. Just try to simplify this. If you look at the blue block, called Universal Services and Mainstream, within the school's context, that is the money that the school gets for every individual pupil. So every individual pupil that comes into the school, they get allocated an amount of money. It's very roughly, it varies from authority to authority, it's very roughly about £4,000. That pays for the teachers and the photocopying and the lessons and the books and all the normal stuff that goes on within the school. Now the delegated SEM budget is the amount that the school gets above and beyond that to meet the needs of its children with SEM. But just so you're really clear, that's not on a per pupil basis. It used to be a long, long time ago. And what used to happen was schools mysteriously suddenly found they had far more children with SEN than they ever thought they had before. Because an extra package of money came in every time they identified a child with SEN. So the government scrapped all of that. So now what they get is what's called a notional SEN budget. What that simply means is they get an allocation based on a formula that will roughly equate with the amount of children with SEN they should have. And so in some schools they might get a bit more than the number of children they've had, some schools it'll be exactly right, some schools it'll be a bit less. And then out of that notional SEN budget, up to the next £6,000 the school has to pay. In Hertfordshire it has been a bit more than that because of the delegated funds, but that's kind of changing a bit because of the way things work. But essentially, roughly speaking, certainly the first 10,000, maybe a bit more, the school then has to find the provision from its resources. It's not literally £10,001 or whatever the allocation is within Hertfordshire and you get an EHC plan, but the more the school can show it's exhausted all the resources it's got, the more you can start to have a conversation about an education, health and care plan. In Hertfordshire it's complicated because you have some other mechanisms about how you can trigger some additional funding without necessarily having to have a plan to try and ensure that children don't always have to go through a plan to get what they need. And certainly there's a kind of push within the system generally to say that more and more children should be able to get what they need from their school without necessarily always having to go through a legal plan to get one. The obvious big advantage within a legal plan is that the services are specified and you have some legal redress if you don't get what you want. And then the purple has come out on here. It doesn't look like that colour on the slides normally. Social capital and community wealth. Well, that's everything else that goes around that in terms of general provision, mainstream provision, all that stuff I was talking about before, swimming pools, employment support, careers advice, all of you, your networks. That's what goes around the kind of whole system to try and get better support for the child or family. That's essentially how it works within the system in terms of the kind of funding and types of support. And if you get all this to work, you get it to all join up in the right kind of way, what we might get is everybody taking responsibility for doing the washing up. Somebody looked at that slide last time I did it and said, yeah, but what you should have shown was somebody having put it all away, and that would be the real result. And then we got into debate about washing machines, but anyway, I don't want to go there. Maybe this won't be quite as good as your automatic washing machine yet, but in time, who knows? Who knows?